So I'm going to cover a couple of those things again for those who just joined us. We're talking with Alan Noble today, who's been writing smart, thoughtful books on speaking gospel truth into our contemporary culture. His newest book, On Getting Out of Bed, seems like a departure from that. The subtitle of this book is Mental Health and how that translates into the very first action of our days. We'll be talking more about mental health interventions and our deeply held beliefs and how they intersect as we make the choice to get out of bed. I should mention neither Alan nor I are medical professionals, and so this call should not in any way be construed to be providing medical advice. I do want to just alert you for yourselves or for others that you would know that that if you know of anybody who's struggling with suicide or is concerned with somebody, there's the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is open 24/7, and that's a free and confidential call. Also, texting home to 741-741 from anywhere in the U.S. puts you in touch with a live trained crisis counselor who receives that text and responds from a secure online platform. So we do want to encourage people, if there are personal issues that you're talking about, to either consult one of these resources or a mental health professional. But beyond that, I want to mention that this call is being recorded today. And if you would prefer not to be recorded, please leave your mic muted and disable your video. By continuing to participate in the conversation with your video and or audio enabled after the recording begins, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity's ministry purposes. I'm going to stop the recording for a moment so that if you want to adjust your audio and video settings, you can do so, and then we'll resume. Well, Alan, I really am delighted to have you in our conversation today. Let me just say a few things about you, and then we'll jump right into it. Our speaker is Alan Noble. He has his PhD from Baylor University. He's an associate professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University. He's the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Christ and Pop Culture. He's also an advisor for the AND campaign. He's written for The Atlantic, Vox, BuzzFeed, the Gospel Coalition, Christianity Today, and First Things. And he's also the author of Disruptive Witness and You Are Not Your Own, both which are published with InterVarsity Press. Alan, we're really glad to have you on the conversation today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. What a great group.
Yeah, well, we're very pleased that you could take the time to join us. So just to get us right into it, so why have you written about something so basic as getting out of bed?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's kind of a trajectory in my books that got me here. You know, my first book explored the ways in which we distract ourselves from ourselves using Pascal and other scholars, other thinkers. I was exploring the ways in which we avoid being alone with ourselves because we don't want to acknowledge our despair. And by despair, in my first book, I was primarily thinking about our sin nature and our need for redemption. And as I went around the country talking about that book, it occurred to me that that wasn't a full account. That's not the only reason why people distract themselves, that they also distract themselves because life is really hard and it's stressful. And there are things about modern life that are dehumanizing. Even though there are many, many wonderful things about the modern world, there are also aspects of it that are dehumanizing. And that's out of that comes my second book, You Are Not Your Own, which argues that our society functions under this false anthropology, that we assume that we are our own and belong to ourselves. And because of that, we're constantly in conflict. We constantly have these problems, including a kind of anxiety and depression and despair. And so what I did in that book was talk about the sociological aspect of it. So sociologically, why is it that it's hard to get out of bed? But that didn't seem to me to be an adequate way of dealing with the problem, because the existential problem still was there. I almost said existential problem still existed, but I avoided it. So that's good. The
Extra points there.
fundamental thanks. The fundamental challenge of getting out of bed is something that faces a lot of modern people. It's a basic human problem, the challenge to get out of bed, but we are in the midst of a rising mental health crisis, particularly among younger people. And as I work with college students, this is very relevant to my work. And so that's the long story about why writing a book about something so fundamental.
Yeah. One of the things you touch on in your book is you talk about how modern society sometimes makes it harder for us to talk about mental suffering, the challenges of getting out of bed, the ways that life is hard. How is that so?
Yeah, it's paradoxical, right? On the one hand, it seems like people are talking very openly about their struggles in public settings on social media, for example. On the other hand, it seems like we can't be honest with ourselves. And I think there are a couple of things going on. Sometimes people are vulnerable because being vulnerable publicly is a way of building an identity. And as modern people, we crave this an identity that we can base our lives around. And so that's sometimes attractive to us. Other times, I think the language of mental health gets in the way. We medicalize, we professionalize, we technologicalize. That's a terrible word, but we turn into a technique mental health so that it's separate from us. And the thing about mental suffering is that it's always internal. It's always inside you. It's always you and the challenge to get out of bed, which is why I think this book is a fairly existentialist, at least one understanding of what that word means, book, because it's about that moment to moment existence of suffering, not the big philosophical questions or even the medical questions.
Well, yeah, and one of the things you talk about is that our mental health interventions, your book is kind of taking up where the mental health interventions leave off. That the truth is that oftentimes people are engaged, whether it's in therapies or in receiving medications and things like that, and life is still hard.
Yeah.
And you're picking up at that point with folks and saying, how do you bring yourself to get out of bed? And
Right.
so I wondered how you bring your Christian faith to bear in answering that question.
I think it has everything to do with it. In fact, I think a lot of the other answers are empty. So sometimes people will say, get out of bed because the world needs you or because you're important, but they won't explain how the world needs you or how you are important. But my Christian faith does both of those things. It says, one of the ways the world needs you, one of the ways that I talk about in the book, is that we bear witness to the goodness of creation by embracing, by getting out of bed each morning. Well, if creation is good, then the life of my neighbor is good. And when I choose to get out of bed, despite suffering, I'm saying to my neighbor, hey, when you go through suffering, it's worthwhile for you to get up and keep going too, even when you feel discouraged. So that's built into my faith. and as a part of that too is this idea that there is an objective and a subjective. Now, subjectively, I may be in a place of utter despair where I feel like life is hopeless and I have no purpose and things are never going to get better and my life is meaningless and so on and so forth. But objectively, my faith says your life is a good creation from a loving God. It is worthwhile for you to embrace and enjoy and delight in this life. And even though there might not be hope, even though you might not receive healing this side of paradise, there is hope that you will, there's grounded, sure hope that you will be healed one day. And that radically changes things, because then you can put your feet on the ground and it still hurts. And subjectively, you're still tormented, but objectively, you can say, okay, I know these things to be true. So I'm going to live, I'm going to move based on those truths, not my subjective experience.
What do you have to say to the person who comes back to you and says, but I'm not convinced that those things are true?
Yeah.
Christians may say those things are true, but I'm not convinced. I'm not even convinced that I'm that good. And and maybe it's a person who struggles with even a sense of their own goodness amidst shame or other things like that. How do you respond to that?
Somebody who's not a Christian, is that what you're saying?
Well, and I'll be honest, I've known Christians too who have really
Yeah,
struggled. I
sure.
struggled at times
Absolutely.
and really doubted the goodness of God.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would answer it differently depending on whether it's a Christian or a non-Christian. If it's a Christian or somebody raised in a Christian home or who has that background, one of the things that I would say is you're going to have to trust somebody. And so trust me. Trust the church. I don't mean, the institutional church, but the church across time, which has confessed that the goodness of God, the love of God. Trust your pastor, trust your other friends, trust your therapist, trust others around you who, when you doubt the goodness of God, when you doubt your own goodness and your own worth and your own value, when you think, maybe you might not put it in these words because it sounds sort of, juvenile, but that you are a mistake, right? That's something that people feel, right? That they're a mistake, that God has made. Trust others that is not true, because you're going to have to trust somebody, and you can trust your feelings, your subjective feelings. Or you can trust in people who love you and who aren't despairing and who aren't lost in the fog of mental distress. And it's a leap of faith when you're in that position. It's a leap of faith. I've been there, and it's not a good place to be. It's not an easy place to be, but this is one of the reasons it's so important. There are many reasons, but one of the reasons it's so important to cultivate thick relationships, so that you have experiences with people who you can look to and say, my experience of reality is saying that this life is hopeless. Is that right? Is that true? So that's how I would respond to that. If someone was a non-Christian, what I would ask them is, do you believe in the goodness of the life of other people? Do you believe in the goodness of my life? Do you believe that my life is worth living? Do you believe that the lives of others are valuable? Your loved ones, that they are meaningful and valuable and good? And if so, why? Because the account I give in the book, which is the biblical account of why our lives are good, because we are a creation of a loving God, makes sense of that goodness. And if it's true for your loved one, then it's got to be true for you too.
Yeah. And one of the things that you address in the book is just that sometimes, our own responsibility to act upon these things, to do the work before us, that God sets before us, is actually one of the ways that we bear witness to others. That there's actually that in making this choice, we have an important role to play with others, even a responsibility uh,
Yeah.
to others in these things. At the same time, I wonder for some who suffer mentally, if part of their suffering involves shame or guilt. And in that case, does this sense of responsibility just add to that, or does it help that?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. One of the first things to go when you suffer from depression in particular is a sense of purpose. You feel like you lack
Mm, mhm,
meaningful purpose. And so recognizing that your life is a witness to other people and that it matters to them and to their imaginations about what is possible in life for you to continue on, uh, gives you a purpose that's part of, I think, a divine purpose, which is testifying to the goodness of creation. That's what you're doing when you're stepping foot on the floor each day and embracing life.
mm,
Um, so I think that's a valuable um, I think that's a valuable lesson to be had there. And you know, it's possible to think about this in terms of shame. Here's just another thing that I'm failing at. But the flip side is that the bar to embracing life and being a witness is really low. It's something that you can meet. It's not too hard. I talk about it in the book in terms of getting out of bed, but sometimes it's not actually literally getting out of bed. Sometimes embracing life looks like being the person who has the courage to call a friend and say, I need help.
mm,
Right? Because what you're doing when you do that is you're saying, I recognize that my life is worth living and that it's valuable and that I'm having some serious doubts right now and I don't know how to move. I'm stuck. Please help me. And that's valuable. So it's not it's so one of the things I would respond with is this is something that you can do. You can bear witness to the goodness of creation in tiny ways. And God, those ways, those tiny actions are sacrifices to God. They're our living form of worship, I think.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, you also talk in the book about suicide and suicidal
Yeah.
ideation. Um, why is talking about that important? Uh, don't we just encourage people to consider suicide by talking about it?
Gosh, I hope not. That would mean I made a terrible mistake. Um, no, part of the inspiration from this book came from seeing believers succumb to suicide. Um,
Yeah.
and in the book, I try to be very careful and say it's not my role to judge their actions. That's just I don't know what they were going through. It's just not my place. Um, at the same time, I think we have to not I think we have to consider, we have to remember that when these thoughts of suicidal ideation come up, um, first of all, they're lies. They're lies from the deceiver, and they're a denial of the goodness of God's creation. And so those are times we need to quickly run to resources like the one you shared at the beginning of this, to friends, to medical professionals, mental health professionals, and get the support we need. But one of the things that I want people to that occurred to me and that I thought was significant and important was the fact that when someone succumbs to suicide, they make it a little bit more plausible for other people. Now, we might not want to talk about that because it seems like, again, you're putting more shame and blame on somebody who's already feeling terribly, terrible. But it's a reality. Like whether we want it to be true or not, it is just a reality. This is the way the human mind works. Our imaginations work based on what we see modeled for us. If I were to have an affair, having an affair would become more of a reality for my children, for my students, for my colleagues. It would seem like something that was imaginable, something that someone like me could do. And the same thing is true with suicide. And again, I've received some pushback on the book that some people have felt judged or shamed by it. And I tried to strike a balance here of recognizing that, on the flip side, choosing to live is a great witness to God's creation and a testimony. And that's an awesome thing that we get to participate in. But I also wanted to acknowledge the harsh truth too, the hard saying, the hard wisdom that when we succumb to suicide, we make it more imaginable for others. And so that needs to be part of what we understand.
Yeah. And it seems to me that when we are at that place that and oftentimes I think people do try to give voice to that they are really struggling with these things, and that for those in the community around them, it seems really important to take that seriously. I've learned that you just never disregard statements that and even sometimes asking a person, have you been thinking about ending your life? Have you had thoughts about that? How far have you taken those thoughts? Many times people want to talk about that.
Yeah.
And it can make all the difference in terms of helping,
Yeah.
being that community that helps somebody get into the conversations that they need to move through this thing.
That's such a great word. Yeah. I think you're exactly right. A lot of people are just waiting for someone to ask them. And we need to be the kinds of people who say, have you been having thoughts about self-harm? Have you been having thoughts about ending your life? Do you have any plans to do this? And even asking and even saying, will you make a promise to me that if you do make any plans that you will contact me immediately if you start to have thoughts like that? Committing to being a lifeline, a literal lifeline to people, I think is valuable. But we have to normalize that. We have to normalize that right now. I mean, suicides are on the rise in certain, at least in certain demographics. And so I think you're absolutely right that we need to take this seriously and be proactive about it.
One of the things that you do in your book, you draw a lot on Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is both this wonderful and bleak novel in many ways. How does McCarthy's book relate to this topic?
I just taught this novel, and I had a student come up to me after I taught it and say, Dr. Noble, I just realized The Road, your new book is The Road, isn't it? And I was like, yeah, that's right. I don't know that I could have written this book without The Road.
Interesting.
uh, because I learned so much from Cormac McCarthy. You know, the basic storyline is of a father and son journeying down a road in a post-apocalyptic world where all the experiential evidence points to things not getting better and their lives getting worse, and them getting caught and eaten by cannibals at some point. So experiential material hopelessness, and yet they continue to hope that tomorrow is going to be a better day. And there's a great line that I use that I quote in the book where the son asks, "What's the bravest thing you ever did?" And the father says, "Getting out of bed this morning." And and there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that. For many of us, the bravest thing we're going to do is choosing to get out of bed this morning and embrace life. The central question, the central problem in this novel is whether or not it is ethical and just and appropriate and good to commit suicide in a world where it seems like things are never going to get better. And one of the characters chooses that path. One of those characters decides actually that is the moral and just thing to do, and the father rejects that. He doesn't have a propositional argument. He can't say, here are the 5 reasons why it's immoral and irresponsible to commit suicide in this world. Instead, his argument is experiential. He walks down the road with his son. He chooses to keep his son alive, knowing that the evidence points to things getting worse and worse. And that's a leap of faith. And it's a leap of faith that Cormac McCarthy validates. I won't give the ending away, but it validates at the ending of the novel. But what I try to tease out in my book, just briefly, is the fact that the father is a witness, a testimony to the son. The father is a testimony to the son. The father, every day that the father gets up, which is the bravest thing he's ever done, he's saying to his son, guess what? Even in this bleak world, life is good and it's worth living, and you should keep living, because his son is tempted to believe that life, to despair and to believe that life is not worth living. And in the same way, the son is a testimony to the father. The existence of the son, the goodness of his son's life, says to his father, there is goodness in living. I might not feel it in my own life, but when I see this little boy, I recognize that life is beautiful and life is good and life is worth embracing. And so there's this reciprocal relationship of witnessing to each other of the goodness of creation, I would say, and the goodness of God's sustaining us moment by moment. So yeah, I don't think there could be this book without the road.
Well, I enjoyed, having read the road, I enjoyed the how you wove that into the book, and thanks for sharing more about that. Hey, we need to tell people about your book and how to get a copy of it. So let me just put something up here. So the book we've been talking about is On Getting Out of Bed by Alan Noble, and it's available from InterVarsity Press for a 30% discount plus free shipping
Wow.
through May 24th. So that's probably better than you can do at Amazon. And so you just need to use the code ESNWEB, ESN Web, when you check out, and you can get a copy of the book at 30% off. And so I would encourage you to pick that up. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and move into some audience Q&A. And so if you have questions, we'd love to get those into the chat and talk about them together. Excuse me, let me get out of this. And the information about the book is in the chat. And so questions from our audience. As we wait for folks to jot some things in, one of the things that you mentioned in the book is that this isn't about your own mental health journey.
Yeah.
But it's apparent that you write out of your own experience. And I wonder how, just how your own experience informed this book.
Yeah, I mean, just like I couldn't have written it without the road, I couldn't have written it without my own experience. I made a decision early on that I didn't want to write a memoir. I could have written this book about my personal journey, and that would have been a fine book. And there are lots of books like that, and there's nothing wrong with them. But I didn't want to write that kind of book. I wanted to write something that was about what I think is a more common human experience. So sort of the thesis of my book is that everybody one day or another is going to have an experience of mental affliction where they struggle to get out of bed, literally or figuratively. It's built. Human life involves a great deal of suffering. The modern world shields us from this with all of our techniques and all of our problem solving methods and strategies and and medications and things like this. But the reality is it's going to hit us one day or another, and you need to have an answer to that. And so I wanted to write a book that addressed that common human suffering, using my own experience to inform it, but without making it about me. So there are very few references to my own personal experience, very few explicit references, and that's quite intentional.
Okay. We do have a couple of questions that have come in here. Joanne asks, what are some practical ways you have found to reach struggling students who do not want to ask for help from the church because of perceived irrelevance, or from mental health professionals because they think they can figure out their issues on their own? It's a great question, Joanne. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, so I have my own story, and although I don't share it in the book, I do share more with students. I have shared a lot more with students in those situations where they're sitting down with me. I can identify in class that they're struggling, so I invite them to come into office hours to just then talk. How's the semester going? Are you making friends? What's going on? Are you sleeping? Are you eating? How are you doing? And then it becomes apparent, this person needs professional help. They need professional help, and they need mentorship. They need more help than they are getting. And this happens a lot with students today. And I've heard this from colleagues across the country in different campuses, that this is a very common experience or scenario. And at that point, that's when I'll tell them, I go to therapy too. I need this too. I waited around a long time until it was too much, and I waited way too long to get help. And getting help has been one of the most valuable things in my own life. And I think for a lot of them, just to have an authority figure who affirms and says, hey, you're not broken or messed up or weird or weak or anything like that just because you need professional help. This is a good gift that God has given us, an opportunity for us to enjoy, one of God's good gifts, a provision that He's given us, a table in the wilderness, as it were. And it's good to pursue that. And for many of them, just to have one person normalize that in a position of authority can just knock down walls. And I would do the same thing about help from the church, and just say, I, regularly talk to my pastor about struggles that I'm having, because I know, and other people in the church, because I know I can't do this alone. I tried that. It doesn't work. It leads to problems. And so we have to be the kind of people. It doesn't mean you have to go get therapy if you don't need it, just so you have some, some experience. But you should be the type of person, we should all be the type of people who are relying on others in the church, at least, for discipleship, for encouragement, for mentorship, for fellowship. And so we at least should be able to point to that as evidence.
I want to thank you, by the way, for the model you're sharing of just what faculty are able to do. We have a number of faculty who are on this call or who will watch this video. And I think what you've shared is important. Faculty are often frontline gatekeepers, as it were,
Yeah.
who often pick up on these things before the University Counseling Center or some other place does. And what are the things that you look for or that you are alert to with your students, if I can
I
ask?
mean, sometimes it's so I mean, I've had students crying in class. I mean, sometimes it's so obvious that it's impossible to miss. Other times it's just a sense that the student is disconnected, that they are failing to turn things in. That can be for a variety of reasons, but they're failing to do the assignments, and there's a mood that they enter the class with. You can tell that they're on edge, that they're not. Sometimes they're not cleanly, they're not taking care of themselves. They look anxious. They're doing things in a panicked way. And often they want somebody to notice, and so they'll drop hints. It's been a hard semester for me, and they'll just leave it at that. And you have a choice at that moment. That's a pivotal moment. You can say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and then move on, or you can say, "Oh, do you want to tell me? Can you tell me more about that? What's been so challenging about this semester?" And the floodgates open. That's hard. And I will say too that that's not something I signed up for when I became a professor. I didn't. There are certain things you're signing up for, right? I'm signing up to grade a lot of papers. I'm signing up to be, on committees. I'm signing up to, teach classes and prep and do all these sorts of things, go to academic conferences. But nobody told me, oh, well, part of what you're going to be doing is doing pre-counseling for students, unofficially pre-counseling, identifying students who need help, and then sending them to professionals, and then being a mentor for them in a non-professional way, as professionally in a non-professional way, as a non-mental health professional, but keeping a professional distance. And it's like nobody trained you to do this, nobody taught you how to do this. I didn't know I was signing up for it. And it can be emotionally draining. I mean, there have been many times I've gone home and I'm just like, oh, just heart, so heavy for what these students are going through, what they've lived through already. And that's rough.
Lisa asks, can you share some more stories of how you testify to your students about the goodness of God?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways I remember doing this with a student who had a lot of self-loathing, was I asked the student how they felt about their sibling. And this won't work, I guess, with all siblings, because maybe you have a bad relationship. But this particular student really cared about their sibling. They really loved their younger, I think it was a brother. and really cared about him and his flourishing and his success. And so I was able to ask, would you want your brother using self-talk like that? Talk about yourself, negative feedback, negative, thoughts. Would you want him, do you think it would be appropriate, or would you want to say that to him? And, the student was like, no. Well, then why would you do that to yourself? Why is it, if it's not appropriate for him, why would it be appropriate for you? And this was part of a larger conversation about giving up on school, because this is one of the things that often gets wrapped up in for students with mental health challenges. Is it's not just the immediate mental health challenge. It's, what if I can't make it in school? What if I'm not going to be successful in life? It becomes an existential crisis for a lot of students. And so we were able to say, okay, clearly we want your brother to not to believe that he has purpose and value, because we believe that's true about him. So if it's true for him, it's got to be true for you. God created you both, and he loves you both. And that, again, I'm getting, is part of what I'm getting from the road. The man sees the goodness of his son's life, and that's a testimony that his own life is worth living. So, yeah.
Jonathan asks, how can we help people to believe and hold on to the objective reality truth we know as Christians, while still affirming and not dismissing the importance of their subjective experiences and emotions?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something I should have qualified. It's so important that you don't just say, oh, you're depressed. Well, you have all these reasons to be joyful, so you need to stop being depressed and be joyful, right? I mean, if you've suffered from a mental illness and you've shared to any extent in the church, you've experienced something like that. And that never works, right? Like if it were that easy, you wouldn't be in despair, right? You wouldn't be depressed if you could just say, oh, joy. Oh, I should have been joyful. Oh, okay, good. Now I'll just be joyful. Problem solved, right? That's just not how it works. And so it's so important to validate the reality of the experience of an emotion. And even the word emotions, that's when you're feeling them, emotion sounds so superficial, but when you're experiencing it, it's so deep and visceral. Emotion doesn't, it's an experience. It's a whole experience of despair or depression or anxiety or panic or fear or dread or obsession or doubt, whatever it might be, skepticism, rumination. And so saying to them, I'm so sorry that you feel that way. And I know that's really hard. And I hear that, and that's a real thing that you're experiencing. But I need you to know that it's not true. It's not true. And what you're saying when you say that is, you're not saying change how you feel as if you could just do that. What you're saying is, I affirm that you're experiencing this. Now, please choose to act on the objective truth. And I'm not expecting you to act on it as if you wholly believe it, but just take a baby step. Get up, get out of bed, feed the dog, take the kids to school, whatever it might be. Take those steps. That's what I would do. That's what people have done for me.
I'm going to get one more question in here, and then we're going to give you the last word. Julia raises a question, and we have a lot of our audience is grad students and faculty. And how about working with students from graduate school? Some of them are very close in age or much older, and the relatedness is a lot more equal. How
Yeah.
do we walk alongside people who are kind of our peers?
Yeah. I mean, so the age thing is going to be more equal, but I suspect that you're still going to have a position of some authority in their eyes. I know I could just speak about my own grad school experience. There were, I had a professor who went to my church community group, right? And he was also my professor. And so on Sunday evenings when we met for community group, we met as brothers in Christ and peers. And on Monday afternoon, when we met to discuss Irish contemporary literature, he was, Dr. Russell. And but I always viewed him, I always had a sense that he was an authority figure, that he was wise, that he was somebody I trusted. Not, obviously not all professors earn that trust. And, but I would say if you're a professor of graduate students, of graduate studies, and you've got students coming to you, they might be your peers in terms of age, but I suspect that they still view you with a sense of respect and authority, and they're probably still in a place where if you were to encourage them to get help and say, I've sought help myself, or people I know who I respect and love have sought help, I suspect that they would still respond positively and take that seriously. And I think about my own life. There are mentor figures who are, I have one mentor, somebody, one of my closest friends who I would also call a mentor, and he's a couple of years younger than me. At a certain age stops mattering a whole lot, and wisdom really wins out. And you're really just asking the question, who has wisdom to offer me and who doesn't. So that's, I guess, my advice there.
Yeah. Well, Alan, this has been so rich. Thank you for taking the time to share with us from your book and from your experience today. And we want to give you the last word, kind of a final word for us as we wrap up our conversation.
Yeah, thank you. At one point or another, you're going to need to answer life's fundamental question: why get out of bed? Or put more bluntly, why live? And I think the best answer there can be is that you were created and sustained moment by moment by a transcendent God who loves you perfectly, who knows you perfectly. And each time you choose to rise out of bed, you're proclaiming with your life, and at the risk of great suffering, which we know is coming, that God's act of creation really was good. He wasn't wrong. He didn't make a mistake. His act of creation is good, and you are part of that creation. Now, there may come times when you are required by your suffering to radically depend on others to carry you out of bed, or to be with you while you are in bed. But even in those moments, I think we embrace those moments, knowing that at another point, we will be that person to our neighbor. We will have the opportunity to carry somebody else.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, once more, we want to mention to folks about how they can get your book. And so let me put that information back up on the screen here. The book is On Getting Out of Bed. And sorry about that. I'll get back there. Sorry. The book is on getting out of bed, and it's available from InterVarsity Press, and the link is in the chat, so you can use that, and use the code ESN Web until May 24, and you'll get a 30% discount on the book with free shipping. It's a great read. It's a little over 100 pages, and so it's not a long read. Great book for the summertime. Just to let you know about our next conversation. Our next conversation is on June 20th, and our guest is going to be Carmen Joy Imes, who has a new book out called Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters. And she talks about kind of recovering the theologically rich message of the creation narrative, starting in the book of Genesis, and how they illuminate what it means to be human. She's an associate professor of Old Testament at Baylor University, having received her PhD from Wheaton. She's the author of Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, and the editor of Praying the Psalms with Augustine and Friends. And you have the link that you can use to register for that conversation, and that's available today. So we hope you'll join us once again in June, and that'll be at 3 p.m. Carmen is coming to us from the West Coast. So she'll be joining us at noon her time and 3 p.m. on the Eastern Coast. Finally, we want to say thank you for joining us today. I want to thank Alan for taking the time out for this interview. It's one of, I think, several he has today. We want to thank InterVarsity Press, who has been a great partner with us on hosting these interviews and providing books at a nice discount. They support us in just a variety of ways. The conversation today was brought to you by the Emerging Scholars Network, and it is free to join the Emerging Scholars Network. You can join that at our blog. It's blog.emergingscholars.org, and just click the little join button. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ESN IVCF. And finally, you can visit and subscribe to our ESN channel on YouTube via youtube.com/ESNIVCF. This conversation will be within the next few days uploaded to YouTube, and there are about 44 other conversations that we've had over the last several years that are there as well. So it's a great resource for your own edification, or perhaps for a group that you're working with. So again, thank you for joining us today. With this, we're going to end our recording, and we'll take a few minutes just to chat informally.